at the MisinfoCon track at the International Journalism Festival. We will be here all day talking about misinformation topics, and we will be starting with a series of lightning talks. My name is Samantha Sunny. I'm the managing editor of MisinfoCon. If you're not familiar with MisinfoCon, we're a community of anti-misinformation researchers, scientists, journalists, fact-checkers, and other people interested in civil society and the science and the ramifications of misinformation. This is our first in-person event since 2020, so we're quite excited to be back here with you today. We're going to be here all day at the Sala della Colón here in Perugia, and we will also be streaming online at the International Journalism Festival website. This is our 10th MisinfoCon event. If you want to get more involved or maybe just more in touch with MisinfoCon and what we do, you can find us at misinfocon.com. You can also find us on Twitter, and we have a bi-weekly newsletter that sends out new opportunities and new research and news, as well as events and other interesting news in the misinformation space, including new studies, new events, grants, jobs, and things like that. So this is our fourth event in partnership with Mozilla, and we're happy to be here at the International Journalism Festival. We had an online event earlier this year at MozFest, the Open Web Festival, and this is our 10th event overall. If you are looking for the full schedule for today, like I said, we will be here all day in the Sala della Colón, and the information can be found at perugia.misinfocon.com. If that is tough to find, you can also find all of our information on Twitter at misinfocon, which you can also find just by Googling us. So we're going to start this morning with lightning talks. Our lightning speakers will be Lawrence Bartley, the founder of News Inside at the Marshall Project, Jessica Dheere, the director of Ranking Digital Rights, and Jack Stubbs, the VP of Intelligence at Graphika. Because we are also doing this event online as well as in person, we would like you to ask questions via a tool called Slido. You can reach Slido at the website sli.do. It's probably easiest to access it through the website for this conference, which, as I said, is perugia.misinfocon.com. Again, you can find all of this information on Twitter at MisinfoCon as well. If you'd like to go straight to the website is sli.do, and you're going to enter the code for today, as well as number 1 for our first session. So if you're ready to ask questions already, you can go ahead and type into your phone sli.do, and the code is 04071. So if you do not want to do that now, you can access it later on the website. If you are going to ask a question for a specific speaker, we ask that you include the name of the speaker in your question. At the end of our lightning talks, I will be sharing all the questions with the speakers, and we will fit in as many as we can. Like I said, if you would like to stay more involved with MisinfoCon, you can find us at misinfocon.com, as well as Twitter and our newsletter. So we're going to start with our first speaker, Lawrence Bartley, the founder of News Inside at the Marshall Project. Lawrence, you want to take it away?
Thank you.
Oh, turn on your microphone.
Hello, can everyone hear me okay? All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out. My name is Lawrence Bartley. I'm the director of News Inside for the Marshall Project. News Inside is a free print publication of the Marshall Project that's distributed in prisons and jails across the country. One thing you should know that in the United States, there are over 2 million people incarcerated. It's the largest carceral population in the world, and it's also the largest news desert in our country. By news desert, I mean the walls are not only meant to keep people in, but it's also meant to keep information out. It's very difficult to get publications in prisons and jails for numerous reasons. One is they have a very stringent screening process in which all materials coming in, whether video or print, are screened, and the screening rules are leaves a lot of room for discretion, and the people who screen are very subjective in their screening. For instance, if a 50-page book comes in, and on page 1 of the book is something that the prison administrators deem objectionable, it could be something related to sex. It could be something related to parenting, and the facility believes that it goes contrary to whatever is going on in the state at the time, then they will not let the entire publication into the facility. They won't just rip out that one page they deem as objectionable. They will cancel the whole thing out. Also, there might be issues that they believe might incite or inflame people's thoughts, and they won't allow that in. Another issue is that incarcerated people make as little as 10 cents an hour, so they can't afford pricey newspaper and magazine subscriptions, and most of them come from impoverished communities or working class communities, and their parents and their loved ones can't afford those pricey subscriptions as well. But our publication has been able to get in, and our publication are free to incarcerated people because we go to foundations and we go to people that have a lot of money, and we ask them for donations, and they allow us to create journalism that's free to an incarcerated population. News Inside has been around since 2019, and now it circulates in 749 facilities across 44 states, including Washington, D.C. and Canada. As some of you may not know, the Marshall Project, we publish criminal justice news on a national level, and we are the youngest organization to ever win a Pulitzer Prize, and we just won a Pulitzer Prize last July for our series called Malls. Not to brag on us, but just to let us know, let you all know that we do pretty decent work. And News Inside itself has been a recipient of the Izzy Award in 2020, and it's been recognized for many awards, and came in second many times, so I don't mention those awards. Well, the kind of stories you produce in News Inside, for instance, is this story you see on the screen. In the United States, every year we have a lot of wildfires that's predominantly on the west coast of the country and a bit in the Midwest. The natural wildfires, some of them are unnatural, but they burn rampantly. And these are firefighters who are actually incarcerated. They go out and risk their lives every day to save people in the community. And when they get out of prison, it was very difficult for them to get jobs, and they could not apply to be firefighters, although they have a lot of experience doing so. But we reported on this, and we had some beautiful pictures like you see here, and some advocates have been clamoring for these men to have the opportunity to become firefighters, to feed their families, and to have jobs so they could do something positive and do something that they feel is uplifting and won't return to prison. And because of that, and maybe a little bit of our reporting, the rules have been changed, and now these men are able to apply to become firefighters. Another example is leading up to the 2020 presidential election in the United States, many incarcerated people, they can't vote. There's 50 states in the U.S., as you know, and there's only 2 of them where incarcerated people can vote, and that's Vermont and Massachusetts. No, Maine and Vermont, sorry. But there are many people who across the country were incarcerated. They had opinions about who should be president, about what's the major criminal justice issues that's facing the country today. What's the major issues, period, that's facing the country today that they believe that they want a stake in voting to change. So what we did is we did a survey, the first ever survey done by a major national news organization. And to put it in perspective, on the news in the U.S., we might see polls in which they have about 1,000 respondents. But with our survey, we had over 8,000 respondents. So incarcerated people really leaned in. They really felt that someone was listening to them, and they wanted to let people know what was on their minds. And after we got all those surveys, there was quite a bit of anecdotes in there, and we published them on a series of 4 different pieces, and incarcerated people really appreciate it, including their family members. We also have what's called Inside Story. There was a study done by the Prison Literacy Project that found that 3 out of 5 incarcerated people in the United States have some literacy issues. So we started, that creates an obvious problem for us because we're a print journalism organization, and if you can't read our information, then you can't digest it. So we created this video series called Inside Story because people who have literacy issues don't have to read video. And we broadcasted in 348 facilities across 35 states. And this gentleman you see here happened to be the host of the show. This particular episode is about COVID vaccine hesitancy inside prisons and jails. A lot of people in the United States who are incarcerated, they mistrust the medical departments inside their facilities for numerous reasons. To lay it out, there are many medical providers that bid for contracts to serve correctional facilities in the U.S. and the prison administrators usually take the individuals who can provide the most services for the least price. And that translates into very poor medical care for incarcerated people. For instance, many of the men and women have complained of going to, or the friends, people they know, going to the medical department, complaining of pains in the chest, and then given a simple aspirin, and they were sent back to their cells. And many people have passed away or have had heart attacks and near-death experiences, and that caused many of them to mistrust these medical departments. Also, for many years, medical departments have been doing experiments on incarcerated people. Just as recent as 2010, inside of a prison in the U.S., they conducted some experiments and they sterilized over 150 women. The United States Supreme Court has since then outlawed the practice of doing medical experiments on incarcerated people, but the mental scars are still there. And like I mentioned before, that translates into mistrust. So when the pandemic came around and the prison administrators were saying, oh, everyone needs to get vaccinated, people were skeptical. No one wanted to inject themselves. In fact, even prison guards were skeptical. And we did a study of prison guards and asked them, did they want to get vaccinated? And not only did they say no, they said, hell no, they don't want to get vaccinated. And many incarcerated people felt the same. So in this episode, we had 3 guests. We had a reporter who did the surveys. We had an incarcerated person who had contracted COVID-19 twice while in prison. And he spoke about how some prison staff didn't wear masks, they didn't wear gloves, and that was very early on in the pandemic, and how because of the lack of social distancing and the way the prison is constructed, COVID-19 was able to pass rampantly throughout the facilities. But we also had this woman named Leah Roivig. She's from the University of California, San Francisco. There, in the United States, we have Dr. Fauci. He's like the leading medical person who talks about these vaccines. Well, she would be the Dr. Fauci of the prison system. And she broke down the differences between each of the vaccines, and many incarcerated people were able to see this, and it accompanied our print publication, and they appreciate it very much. And because of this and other instances, we received tons and tons and tons of mail. If I didn't say so on the onset, is that incarcerated people do not have access to the internet like you or I in the U.S. This is partly why it's very tough for them to get information. And the information they get is from people who have different agendas, or information that's passed on that can get skewed. But because of News Inside, a lot of them would write to us. They would write to us that what they feel about their opinions, about the episodes, about the magazines. And this is just a quote from one of the women who wrote to us, who basically said that getting solid information inside prison jails is tough, particularly when it comes to the vaccine. And in the magazine that we have, we actually took a poll from incarcerated people and asked them what are the questions that they have about the vaccine. And then we went and we fact-checked the answers that we got back, and we put them inside the magazine. And because they trust our magazine and because they trust our video series, this woman said that the magazine was floating around their dorm, and it passed through the hands of almost 50 women, and they were able to use it to make their decision on whether to get vaccinated or not. Yes. Another example of our publication is our competitive advantage. We have what's called the reader-to-reader segment, and it's what we like to call a people-powered advice column, where an incarcerated person in Arkansas, for instance, can share advice that an incarcerated person in New York can use. The first one we use that you see here is about prison recipes. As you may imagine, there's barely any stoves. Some people have access to microwaves. Other people just have access to a bench in which they scrape off the paint, and they use toilet tissue and burn it to heat it up, and they cook food on top of it. They use many ingenious ways in order to cook food to have some semblance of pleasure, and they share it with each other inside this advice column. Another example is a comic strip we have called The Peeps. Some people don't want to read a lengthy investigative journalism piece, but they want to get some criminal justice content with a bit of humor through comics. And the third part is our In the Spotlight section, in which we highlighted Joel Caston. He's the first ever incarcerated person to win elective office seat in the United States. And that gives people a sense of hope. As I mentioned before, News Inside is currently in 749 facilities across 44 states, Washington, D.C., and Canada. And Inside Story is viewed in 348 facilities across 35 states and Washington, D.C. But that's only 10% of the facilities in the United States, because we have over 7,000. It's 7,147 to be accurate. And we have a lot of work to do, and we're trying to make our way across the country to give people some life-saving information and inspirational information so they could activate their sense of hope and their sense of purpose, and they won't go back to prison. And the way we distribute it is through college and prison programs, through direct requests, through individual subscriptions. We also distribute it through accessing the commissioners who have the power to greenlight it throughout every facility in the country and bypass the screeners, the subjective screeners I spoke about at the top. And we also distribute it with tablets. They have like iPad kind of tablets inside prisons and jails now, and it's making its way across. They don't have access to the internet. They upload and download information from a kiosk in a closed, secure system, and we partner with some of those companies in order to get our content to incarcerated people. And this is a image of what the tablet looks like, and that's someone in California, and these are the image of women in Ohio, which I think is just super cool, so I always put it in my slide. And lastly, this is the image of the men incarcerated in Sing Sing prison in New York with myself, and they're holding up News Inside, and they're happy gentlemen, and I like to make them happy. I like to give them a sense of purpose, and that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Should we change chairs?
Yes, yes.
Yeah? Okay. It's a little low. No, it's all right. I'll figure it. Let's see. Two. That's. button. Are we good?
Yep.
Fantastic. Good morning, everyone. It is so wonderful to be here in a room full of people. It's a little odd, but it feels great. And what a wonderful presentation from Lawrence. Switching gears entirely here. My name is Jessica Dheere. I am the director of a program called Ranking Digital Rights, and we evaluate the world's most powerful technology companies, the Googles, Apples, Metas, to mention some of the American companies, and also Chinese companies like Tencent and Baidu, Russian companies like VK and Yandex, et cetera, on their disclosed commitments to human rights. I'll tell you more in a minute. And my presentation today is within the context of misinformation, sort of about ads and targeted advertising. Added up, to minimize misinformation, we must reshape the ad tech business, not regulate speech, which is one of the critical sort of areas that we focus on in our work. At RDR, we produce something every year called the Big Tech Scorecard. It used to be called the Corporate Accountability Index. We've renamed it. And as I mentioned, we evaluate 26 of the world's most powerful digital platforms and telecommunications companies on their disclosed policies and practices affecting people's rights to freedom of expression and privacy. And as you'll see on the screen, we rank these companies. We also produce individual report cards for these companies to track their progress and decline over years according to a methodology that we developed that is grounded in human rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and may I have my water, please? And thank you, and the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. It's a very complex methodology. It includes about 58 indicators that, under which we ask about 300 different questions of these companies, such as sort of how easy are their policies to access, do they make formal human rights commitments, and a range of questions around freedom of expression and privacy. And we score those questions on a yes, no, or partial, and then we calculate a numerical score. So with regard to ad tech and misinformation, I think the status quo can kind of feel like the cliche dumpster fire. And I use fire sort of deliberately because when we're talking about ad tech and what I don't have are my notes here, and the surveillance-based advertising system, what we're also talking about are technology companies' use of algorithms to prioritize, rank, recommend, and curate content for us, which can often lead us into sort of pockets of virality with sensational and extreme content. And we're also talking about how those algorithms are used to collect thousands and tens of thousands of data points on each of us, not only our demographic information, but how we interact with platforms, what pages we stay on, what videos we watch, and they use that information, they process it through algorithms, and then they create categories and attributes, tags basically, that they apply to us as individuals and to communities, and then they try and push us into those pockets of information. They basically label us and say, oh, we've labeled you like this, so we're gonna recommend content like that. And it can become a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy if you express interest in some topic or you're trying to gather information, and it keeps pushing you farther and farther into that topic, which, as we've all seen with COVID and the pandemic, the information pandemic, the infodemic, I think it's been called, how that can put us into these little rabbit holes of misinformation. So this is how we feel. And if you can, I'm so sorry. No, the iPad. I want to see my notes. Forgive me, all this moving around has made me a little bit discombobulated. So, as I just explained, so this is a sort of image of how that we commissioned for a report that we issued a couple of years ago called It's the Business Model, which really goes into depth about how these systems work and how they contributed, especially in the 2020 election in the United States, to a lot of disinformation and some of the mechanisms by which people in power, political parties, people who have certain ideologies that they would like to push, actually use ads by purchasing ads and having them placed on our Facebook feeds and other places around the web to sort of create this alternate realities, right? These sort of, or not even alternate, but these sort of non-realities that look like realities. It reminded me of the Olympics in Beijing or this year, the Winter Olympics, and reading about that and how it took 7 weeks to manufacture enough snow to actually host the Olympics. And if the camera angles weren't as tight as they were, we would see the snow part of the courses and then the earth, just, brown earth next to it. But what we actually saw watching the Olympics was something that looked like a winter wonderland, but the reality was actually quite different. And I think that's the situation that we're facing here. So if there's any question about the importance of ads in our information environment, as opposed to the user-generated content, which is where both governments and platforms have tended to focus so much of their attention and regulation and policy, sort of how should we curtail speech? Should we change our freedom of expression norms to sort of combat misinformation? Seems to have been the question, and to some degree, platforms maybe have actually pushed the sort of discussion in that direction and away from what we think is actually a much more promising path of sort of intervention, which is to focus on the ad tech business. Why? Because that is how platforms make all of their money. So if you really want to get them to respond and give them incentives to respond, that's the business that we have to regulate. And as I was saying, if there's any question about the importance of ads in this conversation, all we have to do is look at the devastating conflict and Russian invasion of Ukraine, and how ad sales and ad has become one of the points on which tech companies are both restricting services to Russian entities, as well as one of the ways where Russia is saying, the Russian government is saying that Google should block false ads about the Ukraine war. So ads are actually a very dynamic space where we are looking at geopolitics as well as profits. And we're also seeing a rise of new initiatives like Check My Ads, which is nothing, I have nothing to do with it, but I'm really inspired by it. It is a new sort of young watchdog organization built by advertisers, people who understand the advertising business, which is notoriously opaque and unregulated, to sort of look at the effect of ad tech on our information ecosystems, and I highly encourage you to look it up. And also in October of 2020, there was a report about misinformation and advertising produced by an organization called, it's the 4 A's, and I don't know what all the A's stand for, but about misinformation and brand safety. So brands and people who are actually buying advertising are very worried about their ads being placed on sites that promote disinformation for profit sites and other sorts of sites as well. So this is becoming a growing area of interest. So our contention is that in order to change the status quo, we need to look farther upstream. Which is what we also said in it's the business model reports, but we need to go farther upstream. And we have to do that because what we're trying to do here is not simply change the status quo or trying to minimize misinformation at all costs. We're trying to do it without also compromising our freedom of expression. And that's where really the challenge comes. So we think that in order to do that, one of the key points of intervention is to look at the ad system. And to look at the ad system, we need to go farther upstream into the business models of these companies, the surveillance-based business models of these companies. Yeah, fantastic. So let's target ads to keep them from targeting us. That's my call to action here. And I'll say one more thing, which is that the need for transparency is one of the first things that we need to demand. This is two quick screenshots from our recent evaluation of tech companies. This is two different indicators that we evaluate on. It's kind of hard to see, apologies for that. But the most important thing is that you see very little green on this page, which is what represents the score. The first indicator on, I don't know, the F4C1 is data about advertising content and advertising targeting policy enforcement. So all of these companies, or many of them, have ad rules and targeting rules. They disclose some information about that, but not very much. The green is the ones, Google, Yahoo, which used to be Verizon Media, Baidu, Microsoft. They disclose very little bit of information about advertising and targeting enforcement. So in transparency reports for content moderation, we get lots of information about what governments request and in terms of content and account restrictions, but very little about things like advertising content. What ads were rejected, for example, and why? How many of them, and from whom? That's data that we don't have, and we need to be able to hold companies accountable. Similarly, because algorithms play such a critical role in this ad tech ecosystem, we need to understand more about their algorithmic system development policies. And as you can see here in our last index, which came out last year, only Telefónica, a telecommunications company based in Spain, gave any information at all about how they develop algorithmic systems. And in that development information, we asked for how do you process data, et cetera. So none of the big companies that rely on ad tech for almost all of their revenue disclose anything about how they develop their algorithms. That's the kind of research that we do to try and hold companies accountable, to set a baseline of transparency against which we can hold them accountable. So how do we take this approach? How do we make ads the center, and how do we sort of target ads rather than let them target us? First, we need strong data protection legislation. In Europe, you've taken much farther strides in this area than we have in the United States. I'm constantly clicking accept all cookies or manage my cookies, whereas that never comes up when you're in the US, right? I was like, gosh, why am I? And then I remembered, of course, GDPR. And I know GDPR is flawed, but data protection has to be a baseline. Another thing, require ad tech companies to have transparent and well-enforced policies about ad content, ad targeting, where they can appear, who can purchase them, how prices are set. They also need to publish data reflecting how they enforce those policies, including why they're rejected and what were rejected and why. They need to disclose political advertising rules and how they do all these things in every language in which they accept an ad. And I must have missed a slide somewhere, because one of the things that I was supposed to tell you is why not user-generated content and why ad content. And one of the reasons why ad content might be easier for us to target, or ads might be easier for us to target, is that they're already, they get moderated before they go online, because you have to submit them, even if it's automatic. They're paid, and so there's already an inventory of them. These platforms have databases of ads. Ads are already regulated in many places. And so all of those things, plus a few others, make it an easier proposition to think about regulating ad and sort of saying what you can and can't say in an ad than what you would want to do with regular sort of user-generated speech. In addition, other things we need to do, policies must mandate access to ad databases to researchers and CSOs both, so that we can monitor and sort of establish this transparency baselines. And we ask companies to do human rights due diligence on what their ad policies are. What are the effects of your ad policies in the markets in which you operate? And think about what that means when you have these giant companies operating in markets all over the world. How do they have the linguistic sort of wherewithal and equity to be able to judge whether or not ads are inflammatory or not? Contexts are different. It's really hard, but it needs to be done. And there also needs to be appropriate avenues for appeals and remedy. One place to start is with our roadmap of standards. This is just a quick little screenshot of some of our standards. As I said, they're very involved and very detail-oriented, and they help us produce the data that I showed. And I think that's it. So I think I'm within time, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Musical chairs.
Okay. It's musical chairs. You're going to go there, and I'm going to go back? Thanks.
Children's party game.
Thank you, everyone. As we go along, we will have a few minutes for questions at the end. So if you do have questions for the speakers, please put them on that Slido tool, which you can find on our website, perugia.misinfocon.com. If you have a question for a particular speaker, please remember to include the name of the speaker in your question. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm trying to do present mode, but it just does the whole thing behind me. Okay, can everyone hear me? And can everyone? Fantastic. Cool. Well, as Jessica said, actually, it's amazing to see so many people in a real room. It's kind of weird and overwhelming, but it's awesome. I spend a lot of my time nowadays doing this kind of thing on Zoom, where you're talking to everyone who's always on mute, and it feels like you're a radio host, which is not something I ever signed up to do, actually, despite being a former journalist. So yeah, it's awesome to see so many faces. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and listen to the three of us talk to you this morning. My name is Jack, and I am the VP of Intelligence at a company called Graphika. And because this is MisinfoCon, and in theory people here have an interest in kind of online mis and disinformation and other kind of threats, I'm going to perhaps arrogantly assume that some of you may have heard of us. But if you haven't, what you need to know is that I have a really weird job. In fact, I used to be a reporter for 8 years, and I have an even weirder job now than I did as a journalist, which is saying quite a lot. I like to joke, but it's true that it's really difficult at parties, like explaining what it is that you do, when often the answer is that you just spent the last 3 days maybe trying to get your head around some kind of like conspiratorial movement and its initiation process that's been coordinating, orchestrated harassment campaigns on Telegram targeting vaccine activists. But what our CEO, John, who you can see on the screen behind me, what John likes to say is that at Graphika, we are the cartographers of the internet. Because what we do in its most simple terms is we map and we seek to understand online communities. And then within those communities, the threats and the opportunities that they present, and through understanding these communities, understand the world which we live in. This is all based on a kind of core concept that we have at Graphika, that essentially communication is the bedrock of human civilization. And that as a species, as humans, we are primarily narrative driven. Like everything about us, everything about who we are is driven by these stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from and what we do and why we do these things. And sadly, more often than not, who they are and where they came from and what they did to us. If you want to see this concept in action, you only have to look at what's happening in Ukraine over the past 2 months, where in the space of a few weeks, an entire country has been able to kind of redefine its national identity and assert that on the global stage in a really powerful way. And just look at the stories that's based on, like real and authentic stories about resistance and courage and bravery and sadly untold human suffering. And then also maybe some less authentic stories about a Ukrainian fighter pilot called the Ghost of Kiev, or some soldiers on an island that told a Russian warship to please politely go away. As a result of this, of communication being the bedrock of human civilization, we as a species are narrative driven. What you see is that with every leap forward in communication technology, there have been huge and profound changes to the way that we live. You think of the implications of this, which is the Eastern Telegraph Network in 1910, which feels weird to think about now, but this completely changed the world. And I'm not being hyperbolic here. It led to the creation of real-time news, for journalists in the room. The invention of news wires, the beginning of what is now the modern financial markets. It even actually, which I learned recently, led to the creation of a national train network in the United States. Because before then, you couldn't safely coordinate these giant lumps of metal moving around on tracks when you could only communicate as fast as someone moving on a horse. And then you look at where we are now. if you compare these two images, this map going to this one in the space of 100 years, this kind of famous, maybe infamous map of Facebook friend connections from 2010, when communication is not just real time, but it's instant and it's continuous and it's all conducted through these powerful personal computers that most people in the room are holding in their hands or their pockets right now. And at Graphika, what we see is that we are currently living through the fallout of this most recent leap forward in communication technology. It's a leap forward that has had profound impacts on the way that we live, and these are things that we're honestly just trying to get our heads around collectively. One of the areas where this presents most prominently is around elections, and specifically threats to the integrity of online conversations and the democratic processes they're part of. So through our work at Graphika, we've been able to partner with social media platforms, government, civil rights groups, nonprofits, and a whole bunch of other fantastic people, specifically to help them work on their efforts to safeguard the integrity of elections, whether that's in France and Germany or the Philippines and Brazil. And today, in the 10 minutes or so that I have left, what I want to talk to you about is 4 specific challenges that we are seeing right now and that we know we're going to encounter in the coming year. The first of those is covert influence operations. Online campaigns that use deceptive behaviors to try and manipulate the political conversation. The first thing to say is that yes, they do happen, and yes, they are real, and yes, they are a real and serious threat to open democratic societies. But the second thing to say is that, you know, as ever, our kind of collective understanding of this threat is perhaps not as nuanced as it could be. They are a real and serious threat, but they should be viewed as one real and serious threat among a whole bunch of real and serious threats, specifically when it comes to elections. And the reality is that those other threats often come from a place that is close to, perhaps uncomfortably closer to home. We also need to understand that the barrier to entry for this type of activity is increasingly low. These types of campaigns, like we've all heard about what Russia attempted to do in 26 United States, these types of campaigns are no longer the preserve of nation states. And indeed, some of the kind of most effective and disruptive campaigns that my team has uncovered have been specifically from domestic actors, because these are the groups that actually really understand the fabric of the community that they're operating within. We also need to remember that actors in this space can and do have different motivations, and often motivations that overlap. So we regularly encounter I.O. campaigns that we kind of believe to be the work of groups that are politically motivated, whether those are foreign or domestic. But we also come across the work of groups that maybe are kind of more ideologically motivated, if you think something like QAnon, and also increasingly financially motivated. Like sometimes this really does just come down to a way of making money. And the last thing to note on this area is there is a growing range of tactics. This, please, is not just about fake accounts and Russian bots, those buzzwords that we're all tired of hearing. Indeed, kind of some of the most alarming stuff we're seeing right now and have seen over the past 24 months are campaigns where they are deliberately targeting real people in an attempt and succeeding in recruiting them essentially as kind of unwitting proxies to act as their voices within the communities that they're trying to target and manipulate. We believe that the response to this kind of activity should be 3-part. It's something we call catch it, call it, communicate, which essentially means identify what is happening, identify the activity, understand what is happening, and then tell people about it, ideally, quickly, clearly, and ahead of time. And actually, if you look at the actions of a number of Western countries ahead of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you can see that policy being played out, and it does appear to have had some kind of success. The next thing I'd like to talk about is what some people refer to as alt tech platforms, which isn't a great name, honestly, but it's what we got to work with right now. And this is typically what people use to refer to kind of online spaces and platforms with, shall we say, permissive moderation policies, I think is the polite way of putting it. And this is actually something that's really difficult to talk about because it exposes this core tension at the heart of what we're trying to do. Freedom of online speech, which is needed to support an authentic political conversation, which democratic processes are built on, that freedom of online speech is what we're seeking to protect, and that is also what actors seeking to undermine that can specifically use to degrade and disrupt and manipulate. But it's a challenge that we regularly encounter. We know it's going to be a huge part of what we're doing around elections in 2022. And specifically what we're seeing is that bad actors are actually increasingly congregating in these alternative online spaces for a number of reasons. Because they have freedom to operate, they can maintain persistence, and often they can actually directly reach the very people that they are trying to target. So an example of this that I'll talk about in detail a bit more later is a suspected Russian operation that has targeted far-right audiences in the United States. And that has specifically been operating on a website called Gab and a kind of far-right discussion forum called patriots.win. And despite being exposed multiple times, it is still active on those platforms, where it is directly able to reach the very fringe communities who are the most vulnerable to this kind of manipulation. Third challenge is voter fraud narratives. The big lie playbook, as we kind of think about it, is not new, and it definitely wasn't new in the United States in 2020, but essentially enabled by the internet has really become a core part of every single, sorry. Thank you. Operating two machines, I'm not doing this very well. What was I saying? Yes, voter fraud narratives. Not new, wasn't new in the US in 2020, but thanks to the internet, it has been able to spread worldwide. It is now a core part of the online political conversation in every single election that we are looking at, again, whether that's France and Germany, or what's happening in the Philippines right now, or we expect to see in Brazil later in the year. And what has happened is that this story that the election is stolen or not legitimate has basically become one of those self-defining narratives I spoke about earlier. It's become part of people's individual and collective identity, and folks have been able to very effectively build communities essentially around that. But the thing to note about this is this narrative's particular ability to undermine the institutions of democracy itself and also create conditions for real-world harm, whether those are acts of extreme violence like we saw in the US on January 6th, or kind of coordinated harassment campaigns of election officials or opposition voices. And the last thing to mention here, which leads nicely onto my next slide, is that an increase in mail-in voting and other public health restrictions during COVID, that is happening during election periods right now. It will continue throughout the rest of the year and is directly fueling these type of voter fraud narratives. I'm going to run out of time. So the last thing that I'll cover very quickly then is COVID-19. Unfortunately, it's something that is still with us despite the actions of some governments kind of pulling back restrictions. And it is a really core part of the online political conversation. As I said, we've been talking a lot today about these self-defining narratives, and this is a huge one that groups have been able to build communities around. Unfortunately, a number of those groups are kind of a cause for concern. They're often based around kind of conspiratorial narratives, and there's a frequent overlap with far-right groups that have a propensity for violence. The last thing I will say on this very quickly, because I am short of time, is that it's something we're deliberately, specifically concerned about in France right now, this overlap between kind of conspiratorially minded COVID groups and far-right groups with kind of xenophobic and Islamophobic rhetoric. So, as I am running out of time, the very quick thing, and the last thing I wanted to share with you very quickly is a particular image. Because amazingly, it actually manages to encapsulate in one image everything that I've been talking about today. So it's a screenshot of a post by a suspected Russian campaign that I mentioned earlier. This is activity that we exposed last year, and we believe is conducted by people associated with past activity of Russia's Internet Research Agency. They've been targeting far-right audiences in the United States, active on Gab, Parler, discussion forum called patriots.win, often with kind of highly offensive political cartoons that we believe seek to exacerbate kind of existing social political tensions in the United States. They also appear to have at one point hired a real person to go to Times Square in New York, hand out rolls of toilet paper with Joe Biden's face on. It's the kind of thing we're dealing with. But the image that I want to show you is this one. This is a cartoon that was posted by this suspected Russian campaign, December 2021. And it's not a very good cartoon, and it's not a particularly clever cartoon, but it is a really interesting cartoon because what you have here is a covert influence operation targeting audiences specifically on alt tech platforms, a year ahead of the US midterms, and with narratives that use fears about COVID to advance voter fraud allegations that are specifically aimed at undermining the integrity of the democratic process itself. So, if you remember one thing from me talking today, actually let it be this cartoon. As I said, not because it's good, not because it's clever, but because it is a very a very transparent illustration of exactly the type of thing we expect to encounter in the coming year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for our first session here at MisinfoCon at the International Journalism Festival. We do have about 30 minutes before our next session here in the Sala della Colonne. Please stick around for a few extra minutes if you can. We're going to share some questions from the audience. Apologies for starting late. We had a few technical problems, so we're going to go a few minutes over time. If you do need to leave for another session, we understand, but we encourage you to stick around a bit longer if you can. Our next session here in the Sala will be on investigating media manipulation campaigns, and that will start at 10:30. So our first question is for Lawrence, which is, how does News Inside decide which stories to cover in each issue?
Yes. We recognize that in prisons and jails, everything is drab. Even the colors of the wall, I like to call the walls a booger green, and that's very intentional to get people to feel somber all the time and kind of eradicate any hope that people have, even down to the policies inside prisons and jails. So we intentionally put articles in News Inside that give people a sense of purpose. For instance, there was one article about being that we're in the pandemic, interrogations were happening over Zoom as opposed to face-to-face. And interrogations, a lot of people have been complaining that detectives have been beating them into signing false confessions. And when that goes to trial, usually the trial judge or the jury, they weigh heavily on that confession and person signed, and they get found guilty. But so we put a story in News Inside that because of the pandemic and interrogations were being conducted on Zoom, then there weren't any more complaints of coercion or beatings, and we went into detail of the different practices and methods that detectives use, which seem to be illegal, but they're legal in the States, and they have techniques and names for it. And some of them were outlawed by the Supreme Court, but others weren't. And went into detail about that, and people were able to use that in order to challenge their convictions because people wasn't believing them that they were getting coerced into signing confessions. So stories like that might seem a little grim, but have a civil lining and can be useful to people. That's an example of the stories that we put in News Inside.
Thank you, Lawrence. Our next question is for Jessica. How do digital platforms engage with RDR's accountability index? Has it worked as a driver for platforms to engage with civil society and transparency advocates?
Thanks for the question. Very good one. We incorporate company engagement very deeply into our whole evaluation process. In our methodology, there is a step. We have about 7 steps, and I think step 4 or 3 or somewhere in there. We share our preliminary results with the companies. We don't assign a score at that point, but we say, here's what we have, here's what we know, here's the evaluation we've done and what we found. What do you think about that? And they go through and sort of evaluate and say, oh no, you've got that wrong. Here's a source that tells you that you've gotten it wrong. And then we have a sort of a discussion internally about whether or not we agree with them and make a decision. And in terms of whether or not we're in a difficult position in terms of stating our impact because we can't claim that what we do causes companies to change what they do. However, from our engagement and from our sort of over time, we've been publishing the index now for about 5 years, the scorecards, which are now called scorecards, for about 5 years. So over time, we're able to see that, for example, the average scores have gone up, incrementally, little bits at a time. So the average scores across all companies are moving in a positive direction. And we can also see things like more companies are getting full credit on certain indicators, such as Do you have a formal human rights commitment, or are your policies are we able to access your policies in the languages of the home market? Do you have a data breach policy that you've disclosed? Or an encryption policy that you've disclosed. And so we're seeing more companies disclose on certain indicators. And so that's basically how we sort of try to measure what is the progress that we're having. We'd certainly like to see more acceleration, and this year in our results, which will be out on April 27th, our next big tech scorecard, one of the things that we will be calling for is for companies to accelerate their policy improvements, given the sort of urgent situation that we're all facing right now.
We have a question for Jack. Does the emphasis on tracking the spread of influencer operations undermine online freedom of speech?
I'm not sure I really understand the question, unfortunately. And obviously, we're going to break the rules. If anyone who asked it can speak up. If not, what I would say is, I think, as I tried to kind of say in the presentation, is that specifically influence operations we see as, well, we know to be like one of the real and serious threats that we face every time there's an election around. They have taken up a lot of the kind of mainstream media conversation, understandably, because they're sexy, frankly. And also I think it's easier to blame other people for our own problems. But they are definitely one of the many issues around elections, where that's kind of homegrown extremism, conspiratorial movements around COVID, like I said, just kind of basic media and information literacy. And the other thing I will say is that consistently what we see specifically from foreign actors is what they're doing is they're targeting pre-existing problems in the kind of countries that they are seeking to disrupt. So as well as looking at the threats that we face, we should also look at the vulnerabilities and seek to address those at the same time.
Another question for Lawrence. How does News Inside hire journalists? Do you have a training program for those who don't come from a journalism background?
Actually, we have staff writers that we hire through the normal channel at the Marshall Project. And when they come in, News Inside has an untraditional way of going about journalism. And it's been a kind of, once staff writers come on board, or before they come on board, a lot of them showed interest in News Inside. So when they come on board, they kind of learn the process through me and my team, as far as making journalism specifically for people in prison and jails, because there's things you have to look out for. Some of the screening practices, you know those landmines before you're writing a story, and you kind of avoid it that way. We like to issue our journalism free and without favor, but at the same time, we have to be conscious of what can stop our journalism from getting to our audience. So I try to train our writers on that, and News Inside only been around for 3 years, and we're looking forward to hiring more journalists who can be open and receptive to learning our process of doing things.
Thank you, everyone, and especially thank you to our speakers. I'm afraid we're out of time, so I'm going to suggest that our speakers maybe answer a few more questions on Twitter later today if you can. I'm sorry we didn't have time for everybody's questions, but please come back at 10:30 for our next session on investigating media manipulation campaigns. Thanks, and enjoy the conference.